"Can you handle all 5 of us?" said the beautiful woman living in his inherited cabin. The bullet missed Jake Carson's head by inches, splintering the wooden post behind him. He dove behind the water trough, heart hammering against his ribs as 3 more shots rang out from inside the cabin. His cabin. The one his uncle left him in the will just 2 weeks ago. He'd ridden 3 days from Montana to claim his inheritance, expecting dust and maybe some broken furniture. Instead, he found horses tied outside and smoke rising from the chimney. Before he could even dismount, gunfire erupted. Jake pulled his revolver and counted at the shadows moving behind the curtains. At least 4 men, maybe more. He recognized the horses now. They belonged to the Dalton gang, wanted in 5 territories for robbery and murder. The reward posters plastered across every sheriff's office showed their faces clear as day. Another shot kicked up dirt near his boot. Jake fired back twice, shattering a window. A man cursed inside, and Jake heard rapid footsteps. They were repositioning, probably planning to flank him. The cabin sat in a clearing with his back exposed to open ground. Staying put meant dying. He spotted the barn 30 yards to his left. If he could reach it, he'd have better cover and a chance to think. Jake took a deep breath, then sprinted. Bullets chased him across the yard, one tugging at his sleeve, another pinging off a metal bucket. He crashed through the barn door and rolled behind a hay bale. His horse whinnied nervously in the corner. Jake reloaded his revolver with shaking hands, checking his ammunition. 12 rounds left. Not enough if this turned into a siege. He needed a plan that didn't involve getting shot full of holes. Through a gap in the barn wall, Jake watched 2 men slip out the cabin's back door. They moved like professionals, using the terrain for cover as they worked their way toward him. The Daltons weren't common thieves. They were killers who'd left a trail of bodies across the frontier. Jake grabbed a coil of rope hanging from a nail and an old lantern sitting on a shelf. The lantern still had oil sloshing inside. An idea formed, desperate and dangerous, but better than waiting to die. He tied one end of the rope to a support beam and the other around the lantern handle. The barn had a loft with a window facing the cabin. Jake climbed the ladder quickly, keeping low as bullets occasionally punched through the walls. From up here, he could see 4 men now. 2 circling toward the barn, 2 still in the cabin providing covering fire. He lit the lantern and swung it like a pendulum, building momentum. When the arc was wide enough, Jake released the rope. The lantern sailed through the air, crashing through the cabin's front window. Glass shattered, oil splashed, and flames erupted instantly. The men in the cabin shouted in panic. Black smoke poured from the windows as fire spread across the dry wooden floor. The 2 outlaws circling the barn stopped, confused and momentarily distracted. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He aimed carefully and fired, dropping the nearest man with a shot to the shoulder. The second outlaw returned fire, forcing Jake to duck. Wood splinters rained down on him as bullets tore through the loft. Below, his horse kicked at the stall door, terrified by the gunfire and smoke drifting from the burning cabin. Jake heard coughing and stumbling as the men inside fled the flames. This was his chance, but he had to move fast before they regrouped. The gang leader, Pete Dalton, burst from the cabin's front door, face blackened with soot, eyes wild with rage. He spotted Jake in the loft window and raised his rifle. Their eyes met across the smoky clearing for one frozen heartbeat. Then both men fired simultaneously. Jake threw himself backward as the bullet screamed past his ear. He heard Pete grunt and stumble, clutching his side where Jake's shot had found its mark. But Pete wasn't down. The outlaw was tough as leather and twice as mean. He staggered toward the barn, reloading as he came. 2 more gang members emerged from the cabin, coughing and armed. The flames behind them reached toward the sky, consuming Jake's inheritance in hungry orange waves. He'd burned his own property to survive, and now he still had to fight his way out. Jake descended the ladder and mounted his horse in one fluid motion. He kicked open the barn door and charged out, revolver blazing. The element of surprise gave him seconds. He fired at Pete, missing, then at the others as his horse galloped past. Return fire chased him into the tree line. A bullet grazed his thigh, hot pain searing through denim and flesh. Jake gritted his teeth and urged his horse faster, branches whipping his face as they plunged into the forest. Behind him he heard shouting and the thunder of pursuing hooves. The Daltons weren't giving up. They couldn't afford to let a witness escape. And Jake Carson, bleeding and running for his life through unfamiliar territory, knew this fight was far from over. He'd just started a war with the most dangerous outlaws in the West, and only one side would survive to see tomorrow. Jake's horse crashed through the underbrush, foam flecking its mouth as they descended into a rocky ravine. The sun was dropping fast, painting the sky blood red. In an hour, maybe less, darkness would swallow these woods. He could use that, but so could the Daltons. The gunshot wound in his thigh burned like a branding iron. Blood soaked his jeans, dripping onto the saddle. He'd need to stop the bleeding soon or pass out from blood loss. But stopping meant the gang would catch up, and catching up meant dying. Jake heard them crashing through the forest behind him, maybe 200 yards back. Their voices carried in the still evening air, angry and determined. Pete Dalton was shouting orders, organizing the hunt. The man was wounded too, but clearly not enough to slow him down. The ravine opened into a narrow canyon with steep walls on both sides. A creek ran through the middle, maybe 3 feet deep. Jake guided his horse into the water, heading upstream. The current would hide his tracks and muffle the sound of hoofbeats. It was an old trick, but old tricks survived because they worked. He rode hard for 20 minutes, water splashing, until he reached a spot where boulders created natural cover. Jake dismounted and immediately regretted it. His leg nearly buckled, pain shooting from hip to ankle. He grabbed the saddle horn to steady himself. Working quickly despite shaking hands, Jake tore a strip from his shirt and tied it tight around his thigh. The makeshift bandage turned red instantly, but it would have to do. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and checked the ammunition. 6 rounds. Combined with what remained in his revolver, he had maybe 18 shots total. The Daltons had 4 men, possibly 5 if the one he'd shot in the shoulder was still mobile. Professional killers with plenty of ammunition and nothing to lose. The math wasn't in Jake's favor. He led his horse behind the largest boulder and tied it there. The animal was exhausted, sides heaving. It needed rest as badly as Jake did. He positioned himself between 2 rocks that formed a natural rifle rest, with a clear view back down the canyon. Minutes crawled past. The canyon darkened as the sun sank lower. Jake's thigh throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He fought to stay alert, knowing that dozing off meant death. His mind drifted to his uncle, dead 3 months now. The old man had been a mystery, rarely visiting, never talking about his life out west. Now, Jake understood why. His uncle had probably made enemies, and those enemies had taken over his property. Hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Jake tensed, pressing his cheek against the rifle stock. 4 riders appeared downstream, moving cautiously through the creek. They'd followed his trail. Pete Dalton led them, one hand pressed against his wounded side, the other holding a rifle. Jake recognized the others from wanted posters. Danny Kemp, the gang's second-in-command, rode beside Pete. Behind them came Roy Palmer and Jack Hayes, both known for their skill with guns and their taste for violence. The man Jake had shot in the shoulder was missing, probably bleeding out somewhere or heading for safety. The outlaws moved slowly, scanning the rocks and shadows. They knew Jake was nearby, could feel it the way predators sense wounded prey. Danny pointed to something, probably blood drops Jake had left before binding his wound. The gang stopped about 50 yards from Jake's position. Pete dismounted painfully, examining the ground. He looked up suddenly, staring directly at the rocks where Jake hid. For a terrible moment, Jake thought he'd been spotted. But Pete was just studying the terrain, calculating possibilities. Jake aimed carefully at Pete's chest. One shot would drop the leader and maybe scatter the others. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then Pete moved behind his horse, using the animal as a shield. The moment passed. Danny called out, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. "We know you're here, boy. We found your blood trail. You're hurt bad and running out of places to hide. Make this easy on yourself. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Make us work for it, and we'll take our time when we catch you." Jake stayed silent. Talking meant giving away his exact position. The outlaws spread out, dismounting and taking cover. They were settling in for a standoff. Smart. They had time, numbers, and ammunition. Jake had a bleeding leg and fading daylight. Roy moved left, working his way along the canyon wall. Jack went right, trying to flank Jake's position. It was a classic pincer movement. In another minute, they'd have him in crossfire. Jake had to act. He fired at Roy, the shot echoing like thunder. Roy dropped behind a rock, but Jake couldn't tell if he'd hit him. Danny and Pete returned fire immediately, bullets banging off the boulders around Jake. He ducked as rock fragments stung his face. Jack was still moving, almost in position now. Jake swung his rifle right and fired twice. Jack stumbled and fell, clutching his leg. One down, but now Jake's position was completely exposed. Muzzle flashes had revealed exactly where he was hiding. Bullets hammered his cover from 3 directions. Jake pressed himself flat against the boulder as chunks of rock exploded above his head. He was pinned down, trapped like a rabbit in a hole. The Daltons had him exactly where they wanted him. Pete shouted over the gunfire, "You're done, boy. Burned down your own cabin, killed your inheritance for nothing. We've got you surrounded. Throw out your guns and maybe we'll let you live." Jake knew better. The Daltons didn't leave witnesses. They'd torture information out of him first, find out if he'd told anyone about them, then put a bullet in his brain, maybe several bullets, just to make sure. The shooting stopped. Silence filled the canyon, broken only by the creek's gurgling and Jack's groans. Jake's ears rang from the gunfire. He had maybe 10 rounds left. Once those were gone, he might as well throw rocks. Darkness was almost complete now. Stars began appearing overhead, cold and indifferent to the violence below. Jake's leg had gone numb, which worried him more than the pain had. Blood loss was catching up. His vision swam slightly when he moved his head too fast. He heard movement, boots scraping on rock. They were advancing under cover of darkness, using the shadows Jake had hoped would save him. He fired blindly toward the sound, 3 quick shots. Someone cursed, and the movement stopped. 8 rounds left, Danny called out, laughing. We've been counting, boy. You're almost empty. We can wait all night if we need to. They were right. Jake was bleeding out in a canyon with nowhere to run. His horse was exhausted, his ammunition nearly gone, and 3 armed killers were closing in. Every advantage belonged to them. He needed a miracle or a plan so crazy it might actually work. Jake looked at the canyon walls, then at the creek. An idea formed, born from desperation. It was insane and would probably get him killed. But staying put guaranteed death. At least this way he'd go down fighting. He began loosening rocks around his position, building a small pile. Then he waited, controlling his breathing, fighting the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. He had one chance to make this work. The outlaws were patient, but not infinitely so. After 10 minutes of silence, Jake heard them whispering, debating their next move. Then boots on stone again, closer this time. Roy's voice soft and confident. I can see his horse. He's still here. Jake grabbed the largest rock he could lift with his wounded leg weakening him. He stood, exposing himself completely, and hurled the rock as hard as he could toward Roy's voice. Then he fired his remaining rounds in rapid succession, not at the outlaws, but at the canyon wall above their heads. The bullets struck ancient, weathered stone. Cracks spiderwebbed across the rock face. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then physics and geology conspired in Jake's favor. A section of the canyon wall, weakened by centuries of erosion and finally shattered by gunfire, gave way. Tons of rock and dirt cascaded down with a roar that drowned out the outlaws' screams. The avalanche crashed into the creek bed, throwing up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Jake couldn't see if he'd buried them or just blocked their path, and he didn't wait to find out. He stumbled to his horse, dragging his injured leg. Every step sent lightning bolts of agony through his body. He grabbed the saddle horn and pulled himself up, nearly fainting from the effort. Blood soaked through his bandage, running down his leg into his boot. The dust cloud provided cover as Jake urged his horse forward, away from the rock slide. He could hear coughing behind him and Pete's voice screaming in fury. At least some of them had survived. But the avalanche had bought Jake precious time. He rode through the darkness, letting his horse pick its way carefully over the rocky ground. The animal was smart enough to avoid stumbling, even exhausted as it was. Jake clung to consciousness through sheer willpower, knowing that falling asleep in the saddle meant falling to his death. An hour passed, maybe more. Time became fluid, unreliable. Jake's world shrank to the rhythm of hoofbeats and the burning in his leg. He thought he heard pursuit several times, but couldn't be sure if it was real or delirium. The canyon eventually opened onto a plateau covered in scrub brush and scattered pines. In the distance, Jake saw lights, a town, or at least a ranch. Civilization. Help. He turned his horse toward those lights, hope flickering in his chest. But the lights seemed to recede as he approached, always the same distance away. Jake realized he was hallucinating, his mind playing tricks as blood loss took its toll. He blinked hard, trying to focus. The lights were real. They had to be real. His horse stumbled, nearly falling. Jake's vision tunneled, darkness creeping in from the edges. He was going to pass out. Nothing could stop it now. He had just enough presence of mind to throw himself from the saddle before unconsciousness claimed him. Better to fall now than tumble off while the horse was moving. Jake hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his body, then began to fade as numbness spread. He lay on his back, staring at the stars, unable to move. This was it. He'd escaped the burning cabin, survived the gun battle, triggered an avalanche, but blood loss was going to kill him anyway. Hoofbeats approached, multiple riders. Jake couldn't even turn his head to look. The Daltons had caught up, he'd failed. His uncle's legacy was ashes, and Jake was about to join him in the grave. At least it would be quick. He was too weak to feel afraid anymore. Voices surrounded him, but they weren't the outlaws. A woman's voice sharp with concern. He's alive, but barely. Get him on the wagon, quickly now. Strong hands lifted. Jake? He tried to speak, to warn them about the gang, but his mouth wouldn't form words. The woman's face appeared above him, illuminated by lantern light. She had gray hair and kind eyes that had seen plenty of trouble. Easy now, she said. You're safe. We've got you. Safe. The word seemed impossible. Jake tried to explain about Pete Dalton and the others, about the danger following him, but darkness swallowed him whole before he could manage a single word. His last thought before oblivion was wondering if he'd ever wake up again. Jake woke to sunlight streaming through a window and the smell of bacon frying. For a confused moment, he thought he was back home in Montana. Then pain reminded him otherwise. His leg throbbed, but it was clean pain, the kind that came with proper bandaging and medicine. He was lying in a real bed with clean sheets. The room was small but tidy, with wooden walls and simple furniture. A door stood open, leading to what looked like a kitchen. Through it, Jake could see the gray-haired woman who'd rescued him, working at a stove. Jake tried to sit up. The movement sent knives of pain through his thigh, but he managed it. His leg was properly bandaged now. The bleeding stopped. Someone had removed his bloody clothes and dressed him in a clean nightshirt. His gun sat on a table across the room, cleaned and oiled. The woman appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray. "Stay down before you tear those stitches," she said firmly. "Doctor spent 2 hours working on that leg last night. Don't make his effort worthless." "Where am I?" Jake's voice came out as a croak. "Miller's Ranch, about 15 miles from where we found you. I'm Martha Miller. My sons and I were heading home from town when we spotted your horse wandering. Found you passed out 20 yards away, bleeding like a stuck pig." She set the tray on his lap. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, and coffee. "Real food." "The Daltons," Jake said urgently. "Pete Dalton's gang. They're hunting me. You need to leave. Get somewhere safe. They'll come here." Martha smiled grimly. "Let them come." "This ranch has survived Apache raids, cattle rustlers, and 2 droughts. We can handle some outlaws." She nodded toward the window. "My 3 sons are watching the road. Nobody approaches this place without us knowing." Jake ate while Martha told him about finding him. She'd recognized the symptoms of blood loss immediately and gotten him back to the ranch. Her oldest son had ridden through the night to fetch Dr. Williams from town. The doctor had extracted the bullet, stitched the wound, and declared Jake lucky to be alive. "He lost a lot of blood," Martha said. "Doctor says you'll need at least a week of bed rest, probably 2. That leg won't hold your weight for days yet." "I don't have days," Jake replied. "The Daltons are coming. Then we'll be ready." Martha's tone left no room for argument. She was clearly a woman used to handling trouble. "Now tell me what happened." "Why are the Daltons after you?" Jake explained everything. His uncle's inheritance, finding the gang in his cabin, the gunfight and fire, the chase through the canyon. Martha listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each detail. "Your uncle was Bill Carson," she said when he finished. It wasn't a question. "You knew him?" "Everyone around here knew Bill." "He was a good man who made bad enemies. The Daltons killed him 3 months back, made it look like an accident. We suspected but couldn't prove it. They took over his cabin, using it as a hideout. Bill had no family, or so we thought. Then you showed up." Jake felt cold despite the warm room. His uncle had been murdered. The cabin wasn't just an inheritance, it was the site of a crime. And by burning it down, Jake had destroyed evidence and made himself the Daltons' primary target. "Bill would be proud of you," Martha continued. "Standing up to them, fighting back. Most men would have run and never looked back." "I did run," Jake said bitterly. "After taking down one of them and burning their hideout." "That's not running, that's tactical retreat. There's a difference." Martha stood and moved to the window, looking out at the yard. "My sons are good shots and know this land. We've got supplies, ammunition, and defensive positions. If the Daltons want you, they'll have to go through all of us." "Why?" Jake asked. "Why risk your lives for a stranger? Because Bill was our friend. Because the Daltons have terrorized this territory long enough. Because sometimes you have to make a stand." She turned back to him. "And because you're not a stranger anymore. You're Bill Carson's nephew, which makes you family. We take care of family here." A shout came from outside. Martha's expression sharpened. She grabbed a rifle from beside the door and looked out the window. "They're here." 3 riders coming up the main road, bold as brass. Jake pushed himself out of bed, ignoring the pain. He staggered to the window and looked out. Pete Dalton sat his horse in the front yard, flanked by Danny and Roy. All three looked battered and angry. Pete had a crude bandage around his midsection, and Roy moved stiffly, suggesting broken ribs from the rock slide. Jack was missing, probably dead or too injured to ride. That evened the odds slightly, but 3 professional killers were still more than enough to be deadly. Pete called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Send out the boy, Mrs. Miller. This doesn't concern you. We just want to talk to him about the property damage he caused." "Property damage," Martha muttered. "That's Rich." She opened the window and shouted back. "Jake Carson is under my protection, Pete Dalton. You want him, you'll have to come through me and mine." "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Pete replied. "We've got no quarrel with you. Just send out the boy." 2 figures appeared from the barn, both carrying rifles, Martha's sons, Jake assumed. They positioned themselves with clear shots at the outlaws. A 3rd figure emerged from behind the house, completing the triangle. The Daltons were covered from 3 angles. Pete noticed and shifted in his saddle. His hand drifted toward his gun and stopped. 3 against 3, but the Millers had better positions. "You're making a mistake," Pete said, "harboring a criminal." "The only criminals I see are sitting on horses in my yard," Martha replied. "You've got 10 seconds to leave before we open fire. After that, you're trespassing, and we handle trespassers permanent-like around here." Danny's hand moved toward his gun. One of Martha's sons, a young man with sandy hair, shifted his rifle slightly. The message was clear: draw and die. Pete recognized the losing position when he saw one. His face twisted with fury, but he nodded slowly. "This isn't over. The boy can't stay here forever. We'll be waiting when he leaves." "Then you'll be waiting a long time," Martha said. "Now get off my land before my boys get nervous." Nervous fingers pull triggers accidental-like. The outlaws turned their horses and rode away slowly, refusing to show fear, but they left, which was what mattered. Jake watched them disappear down the road, his heart still hammering. "They'll come back," he said. "Probably," Martha agreed, "but not today. And when they do, we'll be ready." Jake spent the next 3 days healing and planning. Martha's sons, William, Henry, and George, took shifts watching the roads. The ranch had good defensive positions and plenty of ammunition, but Jake knew the Daltons wouldn't give up. Pete was too proud, too mean, and too aware that leaving Jake alive meant eventually facing justice. Dr. Williams visited twice, changing bandages and declaring Jake's recovery remarkable. The wound was healing clean, no infection setting in. Within a week, Jake would be mobile again. Within 2, he could ride. But waiting 2 weeks meant giving the Daltons time to gather reinforcements or plan an attack the ranch couldn't repel. Jake spent hours studying the situation, trying to find an advantage. On the 4th night, he had a visitor. Sheriff Coleman from the nearby town of Bent Creek arrived after sunset, led by William. The sheriff was a weathered man in his 50s with careful eyes and a reputation for fairness. "I heard you had some excitement," Coleman said, settling into a chair beside Jake's bed. "Thought I'd better come see for myself." Jake told his story again, this time to an official audience. Coleman listened, occasionally asking questions, his expression neutral. When Jake finished, the sheriff nodded slowly. "I've been after the Daltons for 2 years, Coleman said. "They're smart, careful, always cover their tracks. We knew they had a hideout somewhere in the hills, but could never find it. Thanks to you, that hideout is ashes." Jake asked hopefully, "On what charge?" "You burned down your own cabin." "The gunfight on your property could be argued as self-defense on their part if they claim you fired first. And everything that happened after was in wilderness territory. No witnesses except you and them." Jake felt frustration rising. "They're wanted in 5 territories for crimes I can't prove they committed. The Daltons are careful. Always make sure they have alibis or reasonable doubt. I need solid evidence or a witness who can place them at a crime scene." Coleman leaned forward. "But I might have something. Your uncle kept records, hidden ones. Before he died, he mentioned them to me. Said if anything happened to him, I should look for a metal box buried near an old oak tree on his property. I never found it." "What kind of records?" Bill Carson wasn't just a rancher. He was a deputy marshal, retired. Spent 20 years tracking outlaws. When he settled here, he kept watching, kept recording. Names, dates, crimes. He was building a case against the Daltons, gathering evidence. That box might have everything we need to put them away for good. Jake's mind raced, but the cabin burned down. The property's destroyed. "The land's still there," Coleman said. And that oak tree is about 100 yards from where the cabin stood. If the box survived, and if we can find it, we've got him. Legal and proper. They're watching the property, Jake said, waiting for me to come back. Which is why I'll go, Coleman replied. Official sheriff's business, investigating a fire. They can't stop me without revealing their guilt. They'll kill you, Jake said flatly. Pete knows what you're looking for. If you find that box, you're dead before you can dig it up. Coleman smiled grimly. Then I'll need backup. You, me, and the Miller boys. We go in strong, fast, and ready for trouble. We find the box, we bring it back, and we end this properly. Martha appeared in the doorway. That's a suicide plan, Sheriff. The Daltons will see you coming a mile away. Not if they're looking in the wrong direction, Jake said slowly. An idea was forming. Dangerous, but possible. We need a distraction. Something big enough to pull them away from the property. Like what? William asked from behind his mother. Like me? Jake said. They want me, so I give them what they want. I ride out tomorrow, head north toward the main road. Make it obvious I'm running. They'll chase me, leave the property unguarded. That's when you dig up the box. You can barely walk, Martha protested. You certainly can't outride the Daltons. I don't need to outride them. I just need to lead them far enough away to give you time. Once you have the box, fire 3 shots. I'll hear them and know to run for real. And if they catch you before we find the box? Coleman asked. Then I hope you work fast. They argued for another hour, but Jake's plan was the best option they had. He was the bait the Daltons wanted, and using that to their advantage made strategic sense. Finally, reluctantly, Coleman and Martha agreed. The next morning, Jake prepared to leave. His legs still hurt, but he could walk and ride. Dr. Williams had done excellent work. Martha provided him with food, water, and a spare rifle. Her sons gave him advice on the terrain and where to lead the chase. Stay alive, Martha said, gripping his shoulder. Bill would never forgive me if I let his nephew get killed. I'll do my best, Jake promised. He rode out at noon, heading north on the main road. Within an hour, he spotted dust rising behind him. The Daltons had taken the bait. Jake kept his pace steady, neither too fast nor too slow. He needed them close enough to follow, but far enough back that he could stay ahead. The chase led through open country, across grasslands, and through scattered groves of trees. Jake's leg throbbed with each mile, but he pushed through the pain. Behind him, the outlaws gained slowly but steadily. They knew he was wounded and were playing it patient. 2 hours in, Jake reached the spot he'd chosen. A narrow pass between 2 hills, rocky and treacherous. He rode through it and took cover behind a boulder, rifle ready. When the Daltons entered the pass, he'd have the high ground advantage. Pete, Danny, and Roy approached cautiously. They'd learned to respect Jake's ability to fight back. The pass funneled them into single file, eliminating their numbers advantage. Pete went first, rifle across his saddle, eyes scanning the rocks. Jake waited until all 3 were in the pass. Then he fired, not at the men, but at the ground in front of Pete's horse. The animal reared, screaming. Pete fought to control it while Danny and Roy scrambled for cover. Jake fired twice more, keeping them pinned. He wasn't trying to kill them, just delay them. Every minute here was another minute for Coleman to search the property. But his ammunition was limited, and the outlaws were spreading out, looking for angles to return fire. A bullet struck near Jake's head, showering him with rock fragments. Danny had found a position with a clear shot. Jake moved, scrambling higher up the slope. Another bullet chased him, then another. The Daltons were surrounding the hill, cutting off his escape routes. Jake checked his ammunition. 4 rounds in the rifle, 6 in his revolver. Not enough for a prolonged fight. He needed those 3 shots from Coleman, needed them soon. Pete's voice echoed off the rocks. You're trapped, boy. Nowhere left to run. Come down now and we'll make it quick. Make us climb up there and you'll regret it. Jake didn't answer. He moved along the hillside, trying to find a better position. His legs screamed in protest, the stitches pulling with each movement. He was leaving a blood trail again, drops on stone marking his path. Roy appeared below, moving fast. Jake fired, missed, fired again. Roy dove behind a boulder but kept advancing. These men were professionals, and Jake was running out of tricks. He needed help, needed those 3 shots, needed something to change the equation. Then he heard it. 3 rifle shots in rapid succession, distant but clear. The signal. Coleman had found the box. Jake allowed himself one moment of relief, then focused on survival. Now came the hard part, escaping 3 killers who had him cornered. Jake scrambled down the far side of the hill, sliding and stumbling. His leg gave out twice, sending him sprawling painfully across rocks. He could hear the Daltons climbing after him, shouting to each other, coordinating their pursuit. He reached his horse and mounted in one desperate motion. The animal took off before Jake was fully seated, nearly throwing him. He clung to the saddle horn, guiding the horse with his knees as he tried to regain his balance. Gunfire erupted behind him. Bullets sang past his head. Jake leaned low over the horse's neck, making himself a smaller target. The animal ran flat out, terrified by the noise and violence. Jake let it run, trusting its instinct to flee danger. They raced across open ground with the Daltons in pursuit. Jake's wounded leg couldn't grip the saddle properly. Every stride threatened to unseat him. He wrapped the reins around his hand, knowing that falling now meant death. The chase continued for miles. Jake's horse began to tire, its pace slowing despite his urging. The Daltons were gaining, their fresher mounts eating up the distance. Jake needed to reach safety before they caught him, but the Miller Ranch was still miles away. He spotted a creek ahead, the same one he'd used to escape days before. Jake guided his horse into the water and turned downstream. The current was stronger here, the water deeper. It slowed his pace but hit his tracks. Jake heard splashing behind him. The outlaws had entered the creek too, refusing to give up. Pete Dalton shouted something, his voice filled with rage. They'd realized Coleman had the evidence box by now. Killing Jake wouldn't stop the charges, but it would satisfy Pete's need for revenge. The creek curved through a canyon, the walls closing in. Jake recognized this place. He'd nearly died here before triggering the rock slide. Fresh scars marked the canyon walls where tons of stone had collapsed. Maybe he could use that. He dismounted and slapped his horse's hindquarters, sending it galloping downstream without him. Then Jake climbed the canyon wall, ignoring the agony in his leg. He reached a narrow ledge about 20 feet up and positioned himself behind a jutting rock. The Daltons appeared minutes later, following his horse's hoofprints in the creek. They rode cautiously, wary of another ambush. Jake watched them approach, counting down. When they were directly below his position, he acted. Jake pushed the rock he'd been hiding behind. It was heavy, barely movable, but gravity helped. The stone teetered on the edge, then toppled. It fell, gathering speed, and struck the canyon floor directly in front of Pete's horse. The impact was tremendous. The horse reared violently, throwing Pete from the saddle. He hit the water hard, his rifle flying from his hands. The other horses panicked, bucking and spinning. Danny stayed mounted, but Roy was thrown into the creek. Jake didn't wait to see more. He scrambled along the ledge, moving as fast as his injured leg allowed. Behind him, he heard cursing and splashing as the outlaws recovered. They'd be angrier now, more determined. But they'd also be more cautious, knowing Jake was still fighting. He found a place where the canyon wall had partially collapsed, creating a slope of loose rocks he could descend. Jake half climbed, half slid down, reaching the creek bed, 100 yards from where he'd dropped the boulder. His horse was nowhere in sight, probably still running. Jake started moving downstream on foot, limping badly now. Blood soaked through his bandage again. He was leaving an obvious trail, but there was no helping it. The canyon opened into flatter terrain. In the distance, Jake could see dust rising, riders approaching. His heart sank. More of the gang coming to help. He was finished. He couldn't outrun anyone on foot with a wounded leg. Then he recognized the riders, Sheriff Coleman leading a group of men. 6 riders total, all armed. They'd come searching when they heard the gunfire. Jake had never been so happy to see a lawman in his life. Coleman reached him first, dismounting quickly. "Can you ride?" "If you've got a horse," Jake replied. One of Coleman's deputies offered his mount. Jake pulled himself into the saddle with the last of his strength. His vision swam, but he stayed conscious through sheer determination. "The Daltons are in the canyon," Jake said. 3 of them, on foot or with spooked horses. Coleman nodded and gave orders. His men spread out, surrounding the canyon entrance. When Pete, Danny, and Roy emerged, they found 6 rifles pointed at them. Even Pete Dalton was smart enough to recognize hopeless odds. The outlaws surrendered without a fight. Coleman had the evidence box, and now he had the gang in custody. It was over. Jake felt the tension drain from his body, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. He'd survived. Against all odds, against professional killers and his own injuries, he'd survived. They rode back to the Miller Ranch as the sun set. Martha met them at the gate, relief evident on her face. Dr. Williams was waiting too, summoned by one of her sons. He took one look at Jake's reopened wound and shook his head. "You're going to be in that bed for a month this time," the doctor said. "And if you try any more heroics, I'll tie you to it." Jake didn't argue. He was too tired to do anything but comply. As they helped him inside, he looked back at the riders guarding the captured outlaws. The Daltons sat with hands bound, faces dark with fury. But they were beaten, finished. The evidence in Coleman's box would ensure they hung. Martha brought Jake soup and fresh bandages. Your uncle would be proud, she said quietly. You finished what he started. I nearly got killed doing it, Jake replied. That's the Carson way, apparently. Bill was the same, never could leave well enough alone when he saw injustice. She smiled. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need. The ranch could use another hand when you're healed. Jake considered that. He'd come west expecting an inheritance and found a war instead, but he'd also found people worth fighting for, a community that took care of its own. Montana seemed very far away now and not particularly appealing. I might take you up on that, he said. The next weeks passed in a blur of healing and testimony. Sheriff Coleman built his case against the Daltons using Bill Carson's meticulous records. The box had contained dates, locations, witness names, and physical evidence linking the gang to a dozen murders and twice as many robberies. The trial was quick. Pete, Danny, and Roy were convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to hang. Jake attended the sentencing, watching as the men who tried to kill him were led away in chains. Pete locked eyes with him one final time, his expression promising vengeance even in defeat. But it was an empty threat. Pete Dalton's days were numbered. Jake's leg healed slowly but well. Dr. Williams had been right about the month of bed rest. By the time Jake could walk without limping, spring had arrived. The Miller Ranch was busy with calving and planting, and Jake found himself helping despite his inexperience. William taught him about cattle. Henry showed him how to mend fences. George, the youngest, demonstrated proper shooting techniques. Martha fed him until he'd gained back the weight he'd lost, and then some. They treated him like family, and gradually Jake realized that's what they'd become. The Daltons hanged on a Tuesday morning in June. Jake didn't attend the execution, seeing no need to watch men die. Coleman came by the ranch afterward with news that it was done. Justice served, closure achieved. Well, what will you do with your uncle's land? The sheriff asked. The cabin's gone, but the property's still valuable. Jake had been thinking about that. I'm going to rebuild. Not a cabin this time. A proper house. Somewhere my uncle would be proud of. Planning to stay in the territory, then? Planning to stay right here if Martha will have me? Jake said. I've had enough of running and fighting. Time to build something instead. Coleman smiled and shook his hand. Bill would like that. He always said this land needed more good men willing to stand up for what's right. That summer, Jake began construction on the new house. The Miller boys helped, along with neighbors who'd known Bill Carson. The community came together, turning tragedy into something positive. By autumn, the house was finished. A sturdy 2-story structure built to last. Jake moved in but spent most evenings at the Miller Ranch. He'd become part of their family, and Martha had hinted more than once that he should consider courting Lucy Thompson, a young woman from town who visited frequently. Jake wasn't ready for that yet, but he appreciated the thought. He stood on his porch one evening watching the sunset paint the hills gold and orange. His legs still ached when rain was coming, a permanent reminder of those violent days. But the pain was bearable, a small price for the life he'd found. The cabin he'd inherited was ashes. The uncle he'd never really known was dead. The men who'd tried to kill him had been hanged. But Jake Carson had survived it all and found something worth more than property or revenge. He'd found a home, a community, and a purpose. Bill Carson's real legacy wasn't land or buildings. It was the example of standing against evil, even when the odds seemed impossible. Jake smiled, thinking his uncle would approve of how things turned out. The cowboy who'd inherited a cabin full of outlaws had become a rancher building a future. It was a better inheritance than any deed or dollar amount. It was a second chance, hard-won and paid for in blood, but genuine and lasting. As stars appeared overhead, Jake went inside his house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new opportunities. But tonight, he could rest easy knowing the past was settled and the future was his to build. The Dalton gang was finished, justice was served, and Jake Carson was finally home.